Today is Tuesday, May 2nd, 2012, and this is Vos de Sueños After Dark. As promised, I bring you Past Sins 12. Past Sins by Penstroke, assisted by Batty Gloom. Chapter 12, Mother of a Nightmare.
I can't believe Nick's turned out to be Nightmare Moon. It makes just about as much sense as a blue apple,
Applejack commented.
I can't believe you were in on it and didn't tell us,
Rainbow Dash snapped while pointing an accusing hoof at Rarity. Rarity sat up defensively, scrunching up her nose.
Do not take that tone with me, Rainbow Dash. Twilight made me promise not to tell. What was I supposed to do? Betray her trust? Besides, we did not believe Nyx was a threat. Or haven't you noticed that Twilight is upstairs and has been crying her eyes out since Nightmare Moon disappeared?
Her tone softened, and she looked to the library staircase.
I had to carry the poor thing all the way back here and tuck her into bed. Do you think she'll be all right?
Fluttershy asked.
I don't know,
Rarity admitted.
Twilight is taking what happened very hard. I'd be more surprised if she didn't. She loved that little filly like she was her own,
Applejack pointed out.
I try to cheer her up, but the only way I know how to cheer ponies up is with parties, and Twilight doesn't need a party right now,
Pinkie Pie said, her voice lacking much of its usual enthusiasm.
No, she doesn't,
Rarity agreed.
Right now, Twilight just needs some time. But I'm sure she'll be back on her hooves soon. She'd better,
Rainbow Dash growled with agitation as she hovered above her friends' heads.
Nightmare Moon is alive. That means we need to stop her again, and we can't use the elements of harmony without Twilight. Rainbow, shh! Twilight'll hear you,
Applejack scolded. Still, the five friends didn't realize how well their voices carried in the old tree. Despite speaking in hushed voices, their words were able to bounce all the way up the stairs to reach both the bedroom and Twilight's ears. Twilight was in bed, her eyes red from crying. She laid on top of the covers and hugged a ripped purple vest, a bent headband, and a pair of cracked glasses to her chest as she looked out the window at the distant moon. Those three items were all that had been left in the center of Ponyville after Nyx had become Nightmare Moon, and Twilight hugged these items to her chest as tightly as she could. But they offered her no comfort. They were no substitute for the little filly Twilight desperately desired to hold. Twilight knew why she had done it, why she had been willing to let Celestia take Nyx away, and the truth was tearing up Twilight's insides like a Paris Sprite in a basket of apples. Princess Celestia, she was the princess and her mentor. Some would argue she treated the princess like a second mother, considering how close they had gotten while she was at school. And when one of the ponies you trust in the world above all else, a pony who always seems to be right, tells you that the filly you're caring for needs to be taken away, part of you wants to agree. Twilight had tried to argue, but Princess Celestia didn't waver. It was like she was trying to move the sun itself, an impossible task. So, part of Twilight submitted. Part of her agreed with what Princess Celestia was saying and shut down. The logical part of her brain conceded, even though the other parts of her were screaming for her to keep up the fight. She had just shut down and become shell-shocked. Then, Nyx called out to her, called out for her mother, and all too late, Twilight realized what an idiot she was being. She tried to catch up, tried to stop the princess, but she and Nyx were already gone. And now all she had left of the filly she cared for were a few pieces of clothing, and she hugged those things as tightly to her chest as she could. But things would never be able to replace Nyx. There was only one thing Twilight desired more than having Nyx back. She wanted to say she was sorry. She wanted just to say those words, whether or not she was forgiven. Yet, there was only one pony those words would mean anything to, and Twilight had no clue where Nightmare Moon was. She had vanished. Despite an all-out search by the equestrian army, Nightmare Moon and the cult had left no clues behind. It was like they had just disappeared into thin air, which was an accurate description of the teleportation spell that was cast. Twilight herself had tried a number of spells to locate Nightmare Moon. Scrying spells, locator spells, they'd all failed. She could only guess that the cult was purposefully masking Nightmare Moon's location to keep Celestia and Luna from finding out where they had hidden themselves.
Hey, did I tell you I figured out who the spy was?
Pinkie Pie's voice echoed from the library's main floor, drawing Twilight's attention back to eavesdropping on her friend's conversation.
Spy? What spy?
Applejack asked.
There was a spy at the Learn Play Day,
Rainbow Dash answered.
Pinkie Pie chased him around until he used the stare to make her freeze up.
Pinkie Pie nodded her head.
Yeah, and you know who it was? That waiter pony from the cafe in town, Hoyt Kazine. I saw him standing there with all those nasty cult ponies, and I recognized his mane and those creepy, weepy turquoise eyes of his. Pinkie, they, all had those eyes.
Fluttershy pointed out.
I know, but I could still tell it was him,
Pinkie Pie said.
When he saw me, my nose got all scratchy and my ears got all floppy. That means that some pony recognized me, and he was the only one looking at me.
Applejack sighed and just shook her head.
Well, shoot. Makes you wonder how many other ponies around the town were working for that crazy cult. Yes, it does, Applejack. But I'm sure we'll find out the extent of that particular poison in the morning,
Rarity huffed.
I'd rather not even think about it right now, personally.
Rainbow Dash said something after that, but Twilight didn't listen to it. Her attention was on her magic. With her horn glowing, she stuffed her saddlebags with a number of different items. She then pushed open her bedroom window, jumped out onto the small balcony, and levitated herself down to the street below before galloping off into the night. Within minutes, Twilight had made her way to Hort Kazine's home. The waiter stallion and bachelor lived a few blocks away from the restaurant where he worked, a fact Twilight knew from when she needed to retrieve an overdue library book from him. Twilight approached the front door and made no effort to be stealthy or discreet as she used her magic to force her way inside. The home looked positively pleasant. It was warm, welcoming, and very clean. Not at all the kind of home Twilight would expect a cultist to live in. The decor of Hort's home, however, wasn't Twilight's concern. She made her way upstairs and into the home's one bedroom. She then moved over to the bed and magically opened her saddlebags. From inside the bags, a number of items floated into the air under the gentle caress of Twilight's magic. An enchanted map of Equestria, a few smooth stones, and a book, skillful seeking, scrying, and searching spells, all found their way to the bed. After flipping open the book to a marked page, Twilight read the instructions while using the smooth stones to keep the map spread out across Hort's bed. She then set the book down and began to rummage through the room. She opened drawers, searched the closet, and ransacked the room for small pieces of jewelry, pictures, and anything that was both small and something a pony might call personal. Once she had a sizable cloud of random items floating around her head, Twilight looked down at the book and read the instructions on the spell again. She had magically prepared the map, and she had to have some item of Hort's that was of great personal value. That would be enough to try to scry for the waiter's location. That was the single hope that Twilight was clinging to. That, while Nightmare Moon was protected against scrying spells, the cultists were not. Levitating each item she had collected above the map, Twilight cast the scrying spell and hoped it would lead her to Hort Cuisine. For most of the items, the spell had little to no effect, and any item that failed to work was quickly tossed aside. The item that finally gave Twilight a good reaction was an old pocket watch. When the scrying spell was cast upon it, a thin line of light formed between the watch and a place on the map. It was a sight that made a smile blossom onto Twilight's face, for the scrying spell was pointing to an area near Ponyville. Quickly dropping all the other items, Twilight set the watch onto the open spell book before turning her head. Horn shimmering, she drew out another map from her bag, set it on top of the previous map, and kept its corners pinned down with the smooth stones. The new map was of Ponyville and the surrounding area, and once it was laid out on the bed, Twilight quickly cast the scrying enchantment on it. Twilight grabbed the pocket watch off the book and cast the scrying spell again. The line of light formed once more and pointed to the edge of town. Yet, Twilight soon noticed that the line was moving, which meant that Hort Cuisine was also on the move. Twilight leaned in close and tracked Hort Cuisine as he moved farther away from Ponyville. Then, just as the line was starting to point to the area of the old gemstone quarries, the spell stopped working, and the line disappeared. Twilight blinked a few times and looked up at the pocket watch, wondering if she had done something wrong. She tried recasting the scrying spell, and the line flicked back into existence for a moment before disappearing again. There were only a hoofful of reasons why the spell would work one moment and stop working the next, and only one made sense to Twilight. The spell was being blocked. Eyes flashing, Twilight used a quill to mark on the map the last location the scrying spell had pointed to before she quickly packed up her things. She had a direction to go to and a hunch to act on, which was enough for her. She turned towards the door, not even glancing at the mess she was leaving. In fact, she smiled a little at the thought that Hort Cuisine was coming back to his home to find his bedroom ransacked. It was her small way of getting back at him for spying on her, her friends, and Nyx. Still, Twilight didn't let her mind linger on Hort Cuisine. The sun was starting to rise, and Twilight didn't want to run the risk of being caught by her friends or being stopped by any pony on the street. She was a pony on a mission, and with her eyes forward and her brow tucked down in determination, she began walking in the direction of the distant gem quarries.
Twilight, Sugar Cube, are you awake?
Applejack asked. Applejack and the others had decided to spend the night at the library just in case Twilight needed them or Nightmare Moon decided to attack. Each had slept through the night with their Element of Harmony necklace, and Spike assured them that Twilight's tiara was safely tucked away in her bedside table. It may not have been the best place to hide such an important artifact, but it was better than leaving it out in the open. Applejack saw a mound beneath the covers of the bed and drew close to it.
Sugar Cube, I know you're beating yourself up about what happened, but you can't just lie here moping. We gotta deal with Nightmare Moon before she can attack the princesses, and we can't do it without your help.
Twilight didn't reply, and, after a few anxious moments, Applejack reached out a hoof to poke her friend and make sure she was awake. When her hoof sunk deeper into the covers of the bed than it should have, Applejack's eyes narrowed and she tore off the covers. Where Applejack thought Twilight had been lying was instead several strategically placed pillows, and attached to one was a note.
By the time you read this, I will be long gone. There is something I have to do, and I won't let any of my friends or any pony else put themselves in danger trying to come with me. There are some things I have to say, to get off my chest, and there is only one pony I can say them to. I do not know where I'm going, and I doubt that I will return. I don't expect every pony to understand why I'm doing this, but I have to see Nick, my daughter, one more time. I have to tell her how sorry I am, even if she doesn't believe me. Sincerely, Twilight Sparkle. Horse feathers!
Applejack cursed.
Twilight, girl, what are you thinking?
Twilight peeked around the corner and took note of the two guards standing in the earthen tunnel. After reaching the empty rock quarries outside Ponyville, it didn't take Twilight long to figure out that she needed to head down into the elaborate tunnel network of the Diamond Dogs. Then, after a few hours of navigating corridors, she almost walked into a pair of patrolling guards. It had been a close call, but it also let Twilight know she was in the right place. The guards themselves were a twisted mockery of Princess Celestia's royal guard. The armor was of a similar build, but it was midnight blue, like the armor worn by Nightmare Moon. Also, like Princess Celestia's soldiers, the armor was enchanted to change the appearance of the pony wearing it. The coats of the sturdily built stallions were a haunting, almost sickly gray tone, and they had Nightmare Moon's piercing eyes. After that first close call, Twilight moved carefully through the tunnels to ensure she avoided wandering patrols. Now, however, Twilight faced a pair of guards that stood vigilantly at a door in the tunnels. It could be where Nightmare Moon was, or it could just as easily be a guard barracks filled with a whole platoon of armored soldiers. Twilight slipped back behind the corner and took a moment to swallow the nervous knot in her throat and shore up her courage. She then picked up a nearby loose gemstone with her magic and chucked it down the tunnel. The gemstone clattered against the stones, and the tinkling noise it made seemed to echo endlessly across the solid stone of the walls. Yet, after a few tense moments, the guards hadn't come to investigate. Twilight risked another peek around the corner and saw the two unicorns hadn't moved an inch. They remained still as statues except for their ears, which were now turned forward and attentive. Her attempt to draw the guards away from the door did nothing but make them more alert, a little fact that made Twilight grit her teeth in aggravation.
Okay, time for another tactic,
Twilight whispered as her horn started to glow. She'd have to do this quickly, but maybe it would work. Peeking out from behind the corner one more time, Twilight cast out her magic. The magic reached the door, and after taking a few moments to build strength, unleashed itself. The heavy wooden door swung open violently and crashed against the stone wall on the far side. Despite their training, the two guards jumped at the sound, and quickly turned to see who had opened the door so suddenly. Twilight too was looking through the door, but for another reason. First, she confirmed that there were no guards on the far side. She then focused on the hallway behind the door. She studied it and painted a picture of it in her mind. She tried to memorize every detail she could before the guards pulled the doors shut, and she was forced to duck behind the corner. Twilight then waited, staying hidden to make sure that the guards weren't going to come searching for her. She waited for a good few minutes, but then began to smile as she pictured the far side of the door in her head. She then called upon her magic and disappeared with a flash. After she felt the teleportation spell finish, Twilight held her breath and kept her eyes shut. She feared for a moment that she may have aimed incorrectly and appeared directly in front of the guards. Yet, when no pony reached out to grab her, she risked a look and smiled when she saw she had teleported to exactly where she wanted to be, on the far side of the door. With the guards bypassed and a new trick for getting past any future obstacles, Twilight continued down the tunnel. It went straight for a long time before ending in a right turn, and upon reaching that bend, Twilight peeked around the corner and almost let out an audible gasp at what she saw. A huge cavern had been carved out of solid rock. It stretched on for what had to be 20 or 30 stories, and was easily several city blocks wide across. Even more impressive was what was built in the cavern. A castle, both elegant and terrifying, had been erected in the deep underground cavern. Its tallest tower was just a few feet short of scraping the ceiling. Twilight had little doubt she had found the castle of Nightmare Moon, and was beginning to regret the fact that she hadn't brought her friends. Still, she quickly shook the fear from her mind. If she brought her friends along, it would be to confront and defeat Nightmare Moon using the elements of harmony, and she couldn't be a part of that. That wasn't why she had come searching for Nightmare Moon. Not wanting to rush out haphazardly, Twilight hung back in the small access tunnel and watched the many patrols of guards that kept watch from the castle's high walls. As if being underground wasn't enough, the castle still had defensive walls, which only made Twilight's approach that much more difficult. She contemplated a dozen plans to get closer to the castle, but each quickly became squashed by the patrol routes of the guards. Yet, Twilight then remembered the trick she had just used. The guards wouldn't be expecting a pony capable of teleporting, so Twilight began to look across the castle for any opening she could teleport to. The opening Twilight chose was a balcony on the tallest tower, and, with a small flash, she used her magic to reach that balcony with a single teleport. She then chanced to look back, both to make sure she hadn't been seen, and to smile at all the castle security she'd been able to bypass. She'd need to tell Princess Celestia about that trick if she made it back. Her mentor would undoubtedly like to know how easy it was for a pony to sneak into such a heavily guarded castle by just popping around using a teleportation spell. For the moment, however, Twilight shelved that thought and poked her head into the room the balcony was attached to. It seemed to be a room that existed only as a means of accessing the highest balcony of the castle, a room elegantly decorated with the nighttime sky on the ceiling and a map of Equestria on the floor. Otherwise, the room was completely devoid of furniture. It seemed a shame to waste such a perfectly good room, but Twilight didn't think about it long before she moved towards a nearby stairwell and made her descent into the rest of the castle. Twilight felt a lot less sure about what she was doing. Her progress through the castle was slow, mostly because she had to keep hiding from the passing guards. That, and she had almost screamed when she came across a room filled with dismembered and broken training dummies that looked like her and her friends. Even now, thinking about that room caused Twilight to lift a hoof to her neck and swallow nervously. She was so happy she had been able to avoid the castle guards so far. Yet, after letting another pair of guards pass and slipping out of a storage closet, Twilight was able to continue her way through the castle. The hallways were kept lit with a number of enchanted gemstones, though the gemstones themselves cast an eerie light. Twilight could only imagine the precious jewels were an abundant resource in the tunnel network of the Diamond Dogs. It also made sense to use gems since normal torches would quickly choke the castle and the cavern with smoke. These, however, were all side concerns. Twilight had been scouring the rooms for probably an hour with no sign of Nightmare Moon. The worst part of it was the fact that Nightmare Moon could also have been moving around. For all Twilight knew, Nightmare Moon could be in a part of the castle she had already checked. That made the chances of her finding Nightmare Moon before she was discovered by the guards almost non-existent. Still, these worrisome thoughts were dispelled when Twilight heard another patrol of guards approaching. Needing to hide, she ducked into an open door. Twilight didn't have time to shut the door without drawing suspicion, so she hid in the darkest corner of the room and prayed that the guards wouldn't look in her direction. The sounds of the hoofsteps were growing louder, and the guards soon stepped into view, but there was another pony with them. Twilight only saw the stallion from behind, but she recognized him all the same. It was Spellnexus, the headmaster of Celestia's school for gifted unicorns, and Twilight could only panic and wonder why he was in the castle. Had he been pony-napped? Was he being held captive? Did Nightmare Moon want to torture him for information? Despite the danger to herself, Twilight also saw an opportunity. If she set him free, he could go tell the princesses where Nightmare Moon was. That way, they could prepare and plan an attack against the castle. He was also a unicorn with a talent for magic, and that meant he might be able to wield the element of magic in her place. He could possibly complete the elements of harmony, since Twilight doubted she'd be leaving the castle once she found Nightmare Moon. So, with only the vaguest thoughts of a plan, Twilight jumped back into the corridor. Her horn glowed, and with a resounding clang, she used her magic to smash the helmets of the two guards together. That was enough for Twilight. She wrapped her magic around Spellnexus, and then broke into a gallop as she drug him away from the guards. For 5 minutes Twilight ran, doing her best to put as much distance as she could between herself and the guards. It was only when she was satisfied that she wasn't being followed that she came to a stop and released Spellnexus from her levitation magic. She then glanced back and smiled at Spellnexus. He had his eyes shut at first, but upon opening them, looked at Twilight Sparkle as his slate-gray orbs filled with confusion. Twilight Sparkle?
Don't worry,
Twilight said as she turned away from him and poked her head around a nearby corner.
I don't know why you were pony-napped, but you don't have to worry. I can get you out of here.
But, Miss Sparkle, what in the world are you doing down here? Spellnexus asked. How did you even find this place?
My friend Pinkie Pie figured out that a pony in Ponyville named Hort Cuisine was part of this crazy cult, Twilight explained quickly. So I used a scrying spell on some of his things and saw him moving towards the gemstone quarries before he suddenly disappeared. I assumed that the reason my spell stopped working was that something was blocking it, so I decided to investigate the quarries. From there, I made my way into the Diamond Dog mines and eventually found my way here.
Nexus stepped closer to Twilight. But how did you get past the guards?
Oh, that was easy,
Twilight replied. She was still looking around the corner to make sure no guards were coming.
I know a teleportation spell, so I just popped by the guards whenever I needed to. That's actually how I plan to get you out of here. Once I'm sure the coast is clear, I'll teleport us up to a balcony. There, I can teleport us down to the cavern's entrance. You'll have to find your own way back out to the surface from there, but I'm sure you can manage.
Oh, I can assure you, Miss Sparkle, Nexus replied, his voice taking on a haughty tone. That won't be necessary.
What do you mean by...
Twilight felt something firm strike her in the back of the head, and the world just fell away in an instant. Behind her, Spellnexus frowned, lowering the hoof he had just used to strike Twilight. Nexus then lifted his head, let his eyes shift back to a turquoise color, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Guards!" Nexus's bellow brought 3 pairs of guards running, including the pair that had been attacked by Twilight. Nexus looked at a set of guards and pointed to them in turn. You two, take her to the dungeons, and, if she resists, don't be gentle. You two, go fetch the best unicorn sorcerers we have and tell them we need to expand the defensive spells. The anti-scrying spell needs to include Ponyville. And you two, Nexus said, pointing a hoof at the 2 guards who were supposed to be protecting him. Be thankful I need you for something. Otherwise, you'd be in the dungeon for letting yourselves get caught off guard like that. Now, I want you to go and alert all the soldiers in the tunnels to be on the lookout for the bearers of the elements of harmony. I do not want to be surprised if her friends decide to show up. The 3 pairs of guards all snapped to attention and saluted before quickly going about their tasks. Nexus chose to follow the guards that carried the unconscious Twilight as a smile spread across his lips. You shall be presented to the Queen in time, Twilight Sparkle, but first, I need to hear how you do that lovely little teleportation spell of yours. Can't have other unicorns like you sneaking into the palace now, can we? The pair of servants at the entrance of the throne room pushed the large doors open and quickly bowed as Nightmare Moon stepped through. She had been returned to the frightful image so many ponies knew her by. She once again had on her purple eyeshadow and was clad in her regal armor. All that was missing was her cutie mark, and that was a detail that perturbed Nightmare Moon to no end. She was a full-grown alicorn, a queen, and yet she was still a blank flank. Nexus had offered an explanation that her original cutie mark was actually Luna's, and now that she was her own mare she might have a different special talent. Nexus then, of course, quickly went about flattering Nightmare Moon endlessly. He said he was certain her cutie mark would be a crown or something similarly regal, and that it would appear when she took her rightful place as the Queen of Equestria. These words eased Nightmare Moon's concerns, but did not remove them. For the moment, however, she let them simmer on the back burner of her mind as she approached the throne. Nexus was standing nearby and wore a smile that she found unsettling. He seemed to be happy, too eager, and she could only wonder what had put him in such a good mood. "My queen, you are looking positively radiant in your new armor," Spell Nexus complimented as Nightmare Moon settled into her throne. "Thank you, Spell Nexus," Nightmare Moon replied flatly. "The blacksmith you recruited does fine work." "The finest, my queen. You deserve nothing less." Nightmare Moon rolled her eyes. "Save your flattery, Nexus, and tell me if there is anything else you wish for me to attend to today." "There is but one matter, your highness," Spell Nexus answered as his smile grew as large as it could. "And it's some good news." Nightmare Moon arched an eyebrow. "News?" "Bring her in," Nexus called. At his beckoning, a set of doors to the side of the throne room opened, and a pair of guards came trotting in. They dragged between them a limp body, which they then deposited on the floor just below Nightmare Moon's throne. "She was found sneaking around the castle's corridors, and it appears that she came here alone," Spell Nexus explained. "A rather stupid thing to do, considering she is supposed to be one of the smartest in her group of friends." Nexus chuckled at his own insult, but Nightmare Moon remained as still as stone. The breath was caught on her chest, and her eyes were fixed on the battered figure on the floor below her. It was Twilight Sparkle, and she looked like she had been on the losing end of a hoof fight. Her mane and coat were a mess, and she was covered in small nicks and scratches. Her right eye was also puffy and swollen, like she had been hit in the face. "Stand before your queen!" Nexus barked, using magic to lift Twilight up off the ground. The sudden movement seemed to snap Twilight out of her stupor, and she attempted to struggle. Nexus saw this, and with a small chuckle he released Twilight from his magic. This let Twilight flop down on the floor, and she whimpered in pain from the hard landing. Still, after a few moments, Twilight struggled to her hooves. Though, even when she was standing, she kept her right front leg elevated, since putting weight down on it appeared to cause her pain. "So, how do you wish to have her dealt with, my queen?" Nexus asked eagerly. "I can only imagine some of the tortures you could inflict upon her. Oh, and then, after you've had your fun, perhaps a beheading. Or maybe it would send a more powerful message to have her hanged." Nightmare Moon's tone was flat and cold. "Leave us." Pardon, my queen?" Nexus asked, caught off guard by his queen's command. "Leave us." Nightmare Moon seethed before focusing her enraged glare on Nexus. "No other pony is to be in this room except me and Twilight, and no pony is to enter until I call for you." Of course," Nexus stammered before quickly galloping away. He called out to all the ponies in the room, telling them to leave, even though many had heard Nightmare Moon's command for themselves. It took but a minute for the room to clear, and Nexus was the last to leave. He slipped out the front entrance, pulled it shut behind him, and then set the locks with a loud click. Only then, when Nightmare Moon was sure she and Twilight were alone, did she make a move. She rose from her throne and spread her wings wide. Her shadow fell across Twilight, who took an anxious step back as terror glinted in her unharmed eye. "What are you doing here?" Nightmare Moon asked, her voice dripping with hatred and paranoia. "Have you come to try and purify me as you did before? Have you come to use the elements of harmony to save Equestria? Have you come to destroy me?" Twilight shrank away from the imposing alicorn before her and flattened her ears against her head.
I...
Nightmare Moon slammed a hoof against the floor and bent her head down to Twilight's eye level.
Why are you here? I came to say I'm sorry.
Twilight spat out as quickly as her mouth would allow. Twilight's words echoed hauntingly across the hall, and Nightmare Moon remained as still as stone. She simply stared at Twilight for a time, but then stepped back, folded her wing, and sat back down on her throne.
It's too late for apologies. But don't try to lie to me,
Nightmare Moon snapped.
I can see through your charade. Celestia came to visit. You two talked in private. And then she came into the library kitchen. She spoke sweet words about wanting me to see a doctor, just to make sure I was healthy, and how I could spend the night at the palace and even see your old room at her school. Of course I was naive enough to believe her, but you knew what was going on. You knew. And that's why you couldn't even look at me when she was taking me out the door. You conspired with her against me, just as you do now. You knew what she was going to do, and you did nothing to stop her. Please, Nix, I'm so sorry,
Twilight said. She took a careful step forward and looked at Nightmare Moon with her one good eye, since the other was still swollen shut.
My name is not Nix. It is Nightmare Moon. You can call yourself whatever you want, Nightmare Moon, Queen Moon, the Empress of Equestria. You'll always be next to me,
Twilight said, her voice taking on a comforting tone. Yet the comfort Twilight tried to offer only made Nightmare Moon's gaze harden.
Oh, how so very sentimental of you, Twilight Sparkle. Pity that sentiment wasn't there when Celestia was taking me away. Though, now that I think about it, you probably wanted her to take me away. No, Nix, I didn't. Don't spew your lies here.
Nightmare Moon interrupted with a bellow.
You saw who I was. You saw the truth, and no matter how much you denied it, you were scared of what I would become. So you let Celestia take me away so you could forget about me and go back to your happy little life. Go back and pretend. Pretend like I was never even there. I was scared. I'll admit it,
Twilight said, trying to defend herself. She took another anxious step closer to Nightmare Moon.
Princess Celestia was scared too, and she convinced me that I had to let her take you, so that you could be tested. She just wanted to be sure you weren't a threat to Equestria. Princess Celestia never meant to take you away forever.
Nightmare Moon flicked her gaze away from Twilight and spoke in a cold, uncaring, yet strangely quiet tone.
Those are sweet lies and nothing more. No, Nix, it's the truth,
Twilight assured.
I didn't want Princess Celestia to take you. I heard you call out to me, and I tried to stop the princess. I ran out of the library after you two, but the chariot was already gone. I wanted to stop it, Nix. I did. A touching story, but that's all it is, Nightmare Moon snipped coldly. No matter what your intentions were, it was your actions that set this all in motion. It is through your actions that you have done ill against me, and it's your actions for which you shall receive no forgiveness. And do not think that I have forgotten the stream of lies you filled my head with, Nightmare Moon continued. After the spring play, you said that I was not Nightmare Moon, that I could never be her. Well, if that was true, we wouldn't be sitting here now, would we? Now that I think about it, I have to wonder if that lie was more for your own sake. You were just trying to deny the truth that stared you in the face, weren't you?
Twilight shook her head.
It wasn't a lie, Nix, and it still isn't a lie. Or at least, it doesn't have to be.
Nightmare Moon fixed Twilight with a contempt-filled glare.
You are truly in denial when you can look upon me as I am and not see me as Nightmare Moon. Nix, ponies choose who they want to be,
Twilight insisted, her voice laced with desperation.
We all have that choice, and so do you. You are only Nightmare Moon if you want to be, and my Nix wouldn't want to be doing all of this. She wouldn't want to take over Equestria or make her friends worry.
A disheartened chuckle escaped Nightmare Moon's lips.
Worry?
Now that is your cruelest joke yet, Twilight Sparkle.
No pony is foolish enough to worry about me. Really? Because I can think of 3.
Twilight said firmly as she took another step forward.
3 crusaders who were your closest friends.
A memory flashed in Nightmare Moon's mind of Scootaloo staring up at her. Scootaloo had been the one pony in the crowd besides Twilight who hadn't looked at her in fear the night the resurrection spell was complete. Her eyes had instead been filled with concern, confusion, and sadness. Nightmare huffed through her nose and looked away from Twilight, for she was unable to bear the sight of her pathetic, pleading eyes any more.
They will need to learn that their friend is never coming back, and that she's gone forever. She doesn't have to be, Twilight argued. Nix, you don't have to be. Enough!
Nightmare Moon screeched, the command punctuated by her wings unfurling. Still, Nightmare Moon caught her outburst. She took a deep breath, refolded her wings, and settled back into her throne. She looked past Twilight to the throne room door. Nexus! Guards! Spell Nexus and the 2 guards slipped into the room within seconds of being called, galloped up to the throne, and bowed to their queen. What are your orders, your highness?
With Twilight Sparkle in our custody, there is no threat posed by the elements of harmony. Celestia and Luna are defenseless,
Nightmare Moon said proudly as she raised her head high.
We must simply wait for the prime opportunity to strike against the royal sisters. No!
Twilight said as a look of panic grew on her face. It was the look of a pony whose desperate gambit had failed, whose last hopes had slipped away from her grip. It was an expression Nightmare Moon couldn't bear to look at, and instead she focused her gaze on Spell Nexus.
Soon I will fly to Canterlot and take the kingdom, but for this day I wish to retire to my chambers and rest.
Nexus deepened his bow to the point where his nose was almost touching the floor. Of course, your excellence. And what would you have me do with Twilight Sparkle?
You have done quite enough already, Spell Nexus,
Nightmare Moon seethed, her words dripping with her disappointment. The harsh tone of her queen's voice caused Nexus to raise his head with a look of confusion painted across his face. Your Majesty? Nightmare Moon once again stood up and unfolded her wings, only this time she was casting her dark shadow across Spell Nexus, causing him to cower where he stood.
Do you, at all, recall my orders?
Your Majesty,
Let me refresh your memory,
Nightmare Moon snapped, cutting him off.
I told you that if any of the bearers of the elements of harmony were found, that they were to be captured, unharmed, and Twilight Sparkle brought directly to me immediately.
Your Highness, you must understand.
Silence, fool!
Nightmare Moon bellowed.
I gave you one simple order, and you failed to follow it in spirit or letter. Give me one single reason why I shouldn't have your head for this.
My queen, Spell Nexus stuttered. He grappled with his words, trying to find a way to defend his action. When he was unable to do even that, he dropped to the floor and bowed as low as he could. Forgive me, your highness. I was only trying to act in your best interests. We needed to know how Twilight Sparkle had snuck into the castle, but she would not tell us without persuasion. I beg you, have mercy. Nightmare Moon remained silent for a time, glaring daggers at Nexus. She then huffed and turned, walking back to her throne.
I will forgive this grave sin you have committed, if you can follow my next order to the letter, and without fail.
Anything, your highness, Nexus said desperately. Nightmare Moon turned and sat in her throne, tucking her wings away carefully.
Twilight Sparkle is to be taken to the dungeon and given a cell of her own. Her injuries are to be tended by the finest doctors we have available, given the same treatment you would give to any of our own ponies. Ensure that she has a proper blanket and pillow. She is also to be fed properly while in your custody, and not just bread and water. She is to be given real food, food you yourself would be willing to eat, Nexus.
Nexus blinked in confusion before speaking. But your highness, she...
Do you question my will, Nexus?
Nightmare Moon asked, her voice a deep rumble.
Twilight Sparkle has failed utterly. Her foolish ploy at sentimentality has crumbled, and, in her failure, she has ensured our victory. Now she poses as much threat to me as an ant, and I can deal with her at my leisure, and at a time of my choosing. Until then, you shall follow my orders, and treat her as I have directed, so that she is in prime condition for when I take my revenge. And, If I discover that she has been harmed again by you or the guards, it will not be her hanging from the gallows. Do I make myself clear?"
Twilight had paled and looked like she was on the verge of tears. Spell Nexus, on the other hand, had quickly scampered up to the throne and offered his queen another bow. "Of course, your majesty. I should never have doubted your wisdom. She shall be shown the utmost care, so that she can truly appreciate the pain you will inflict upon her in time. I will see to it personally."
"Good,"
Nightmare Moon replied.
"And to ensure that you obey, here is a small taste of my wrath. I hope you remember it the next time you think to cross me."
With that, a small bolt of lightning cracked from behind Nightmare Moon's mane and struck Nexus on his flank. He would have yelped in pain, but he bit back the cry and continued to bow. The bolt left a mark of singed hair, and though it had done no real damage, the expression on Nexus's face made it clear it was quite painful. The spot would undoubtedly be tender for days to come. Once the worst of the pain had subsided, Nexus stood and rushed off, intending to relay Nightmare Moon's orders to every pony in the castle. Nightmare Moon watched him leave, and only once Nexus was out of the room did she allow herself a few breaths to calm herself down. She then glanced over to the ponies who were still in the room, the 2 guards, and Twilight.
"I am now retiring for the day,"
Nightmare Moon announced as she stood from her throne, forcing herself to look straight ahead as she walked past Twilight and towards the throne room doors.
"I expect you to escort Twilight Sparkle to her cell and ensure everything I told Spell Nexus is done. Report to me directly if any pony has failed to obey my orders."
Yes, my queen. The 2 guards replied in unison before moving next to Twilight. While the pair had tossed Twilight into the room like a sack of potatoes initially, the 2 guards were now handling her as if she were the most fragile thing in the world. They escorted her from the room, helped Twilight keep the weight off of her hurt hoof, and did everything they could to keep Nightmare Moon from redirecting her anger to them. Nightmare Moon's anger had not cooled when she reached her bedroom. In truth, it had only reached a more violent boil as she thought more about Twilight and Spell Nexus. She threw open the door to her bedchamber and slammed it shut as soon as she had stepped inside. Then, for extra measure, Nightmare Moon took out her bookcase and slammed it against the door, ensuring she would not be disturbed. Her solitude guaranteed, Nightmare Moon began to remove her armor. The armor was comfortable as armor could be. Still, with her patience worn thin by both Twilight and Nexus, she could not stand to wear it any longer. She threw each piece against the nearby wall, letting the bits of metal form a cluttered pile on the floor. It was her attempt at venting some frustration, but it offered little relief.
"How dare she?"
Nightmare Moon seethed as she approached her vanity. On one side of the vanity, next to her makeup, rested a bowl, pitcher, and cloth. She poured the water from inside the pitcher into the bowl. Then she wet the cloth and used it to remove her eyeshadow as she continued to rant to her reflection.
"How dare Twilight come to me to spew more of her lies? How dare she call me Nyx? Does she think I'm still an ignorant fool? Does she think I'll be swayed by her words again? I should have cut her down where she stood for her arrogance alone. And Nexus!"
Nightmare Moon seethed. She finished cleaning off her makeup and tossed the wet rag into the waiting bowl.
"He is lucky his transgressions only earned him a sore thank. They are all forgetting who I am," she said to her reflection. "But I'll make them remember. I'll show Twilight I am no longer the cowering filly she found, and Nexus will learn that I am a mare not to be trifled with. They will both learn that Celestia's fear of me and my potential was wise."
The thought of Celestia made Nightmare Moon grit her teeth.
"And Celestia, she will learn all too well the depths of my wrath, both her and Twilight. Twilight for abandoning me, and Celestia for taking me away. They will both pay for..."
Nightmare Moon grunted, and before she could stop herself, lifted a hoof and smashed into the mirror. The surface cracked and spiderwebbed from her blow, and her reflection became fragmented and distorted so dozens of reflections of her eyes were staring back at her.
"No,"
Nightmare Moon whispered, her words dripping with the venom of her anger.
"I do not care that I was taken away in the night. I do not care that I was stolen from my home and that Twilight did nothing. No, they will be judged for their crimes against me. Celestia shall regret sealing me in the moon, and Twilight will pay for bringing the elements of harmony against me. They shall know no remorse, no mercy. I am Nightmare Moon, and they will pay for what they've done.
That was Past Sins, Chapter 12. This is exactly why we're switching to every 2 weeks, every pony. I love you, but recording length before editing is 1 hour and 24 minutes and 35 seconds. Oh my goodness. I'm sleepy. That was harsh. I'm glad I warmed up. Love you guys. You guys are awesome. Wonderful. You're my favorites. With that, I bid you adieu. Next week will probably be 2 chapters of So Long, but I don't know yet. Wait, not next week. 2 weeks. 2 weeks from now. Yes. Brain not work right. Brain no think good. Cotton candy brain. Peace out. Safe travels, Everpony. Drink, bitch. I'm gonna. You don't even know. Safe travels, Everpony. This is VDSAD signing off.